Hi class. Today we're going to be going on to lesson 2 of unit number 2, changes in supply and demand. But first we'll go over some of the homework to make sure that you have done your work and can check over to make sure you have understanding of what we went through yesterday. So just take a look at what we have for number 1 and number 2, talking about what is demand, what is a market, what is an economy. Number 3 and 4 discuss what happens if the prices change, what's happening to quantity demanded. Make sure you take a look at your homework to make sure that you have the correct answers. So, today's lesson on changes in supply and demand, our learning goals are to know how to graph a supply and demand analysis, to be able to interpret changes in supply and demand and the impact to equilibrium prices, understand how supply and demand changes, the difference between a change and a movement in quantity. That'll be a big one today. We'll go through some classroom discussion and obviously the completion of your homework. So part of the homework talked about surplus and shortage, and so let's make sure we have the right answers and the right ability to look at these two concepts. So what is a surplus? A surplus is if there are more goods supplied than demanded. So there are too many of a thing. And so let's look at our scenario with price and quantity. So we have our supply and demand, as we learned how to graph last lesson. We have our price and quantity at equilibrium, and so at this point we have equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. And so if in a free market system where prices are allowed to move, quantity is allowed to move as the market dictates, we would get to consensus price and quantity here. However, in some scenarios you might have a scenario where you could have a price that was set higher. Okay, so if prices are set higher, what's that going to mean for our supply and demand analysis? And so this is why it's very important that you understand how graphs work. And so let's go back a little bit here. So if prices are set here, we have price, and how does that price interact with our demand, which is the blue curve, and our supply, which is the red curve? So let's go back to the first one. So prices are here, prices are very high, above equilibrium. That means that our quantity that we demand is right here. Okay, and so that'll intersect there and head down to our quantity down here. So quantity demanded is here. Well, if prices are up here, that intersects our supply curve here, so the prices are high. And so last class we learned that if prices are higher, then suppliers want to supply more, and so then quantity supplied will be here. So if prices are very high, our quantity demanded is low and our quantity supplied is high, and therefore we have what is known as a surplus. And so hopefully you noticed the terminology I was using. I didn't say demand was low and I didn't say supply was high. I said the quantity demanded is low at this price, while the quantity supplied is high at this price. And so that terminology is very important. So to say quantity supplied is different than saying supply, and to say quantity demanded is different than saying demand. So if the quantity supplied of a product exceeds the quantity demanded of a product at a given price level, a surplus should and will occur. So that's our basic understanding of surplus. The next component is shortage. So shortage talks about a situation where there are more goods demanded than supplied. So let's go back to our original baseline scenario. We have an equilibrium price, an equilibrium quantity. If more free markets were left to go as they would, we would end up at this point where we're at equilibrium consensus of price and quantity. However, if prices are low, so for some artificial reason prices are set to this amount, then it intersects with our supply curve here. And so if prices are low, suppliers are less willing to supply, so our quantity supplied will be low. And if prices are very low, our demanders are wanting to buy more, so our quantity demanded is higher. And so then we have a quantity supplied and a quantity demanded as depicted by QS and QD, and therefore we will have a shortage because there's more quantity demanded, more people want to buy than there's quantity supplied, then suppliers are willing to sell. And so I'll use this shortage situation to show you the example. So in this situation, there's less product or less service available and more people wanting to buy it. So if this many people want to buy it, there's this many people without this product, what's likely to happen or what should happen? These people who cannot get this product are willing to pay a bit more. You know what? I can't get it. I'll pay a little bit extra. So that'll push the price a little bit higher, and then that'll increase the quantity that is supplied and go up to here. At the same time, it'll decrease quantity demanded until we get to equilibrium price. And so when the shortage occurs, there's upward pressure on prices. In the same way that if there is a surplus, there's too much product, so these companies want to sell their product, and so there's downward pressure up. They'll drop their prices, they'll go on sale or whatnot, and so there's downward pressure on prices until we get to an equilibrium level. So that's how shortage and surplus work, and that's how price pressure works to go up or down based on if we have a shortage or if we have a surplus. So you can think about if there's scalpers for tickets, right? If there's limited quantity of something, people are going to be willing to pay more than the actual retail or ticket price. So they're willing to pay a bit extra to get that thing because the supply is so limited. Okay? So now we want to talk about what actually impacts our supply and demand curves. So we're talking about changes in the entire curve, not movements along the curve, right? So we're talking about a situation where the entire supply curve, this red line, is going to be different, or this entire demand curve, this blue line, is going to be different. We're not talking about if you move from point to point to point to point to point on the demand curve, or do the same on the supply curve. We're talking about what is going to make the fundamental supply change or the fundamental demand actually change. And so when we're talking about change in supply and demand, we want to talk about what's going to change your tastes and preferences. So think about this. Imagine you're all in grade 12 right now, or grade 11 perhaps. Your changes and your tastes and preferences have changed from grade 9 to now, right? You might like different music. You might like different food, right? Things might become more popular, right? And so as you go along, things may change and things may be different for you, and your preference may change for one product or service from yesterday, or to tomorrow. So preferences could be things like popularity, right? Some musical artists might have been popular 3 years ago, but now is no longer popular, right? So you can see how your tastes and preferences may change your desire to purchase something in its entirety from previous years. Okay. The next one is income, right? So right now, most of you probably don't have that much income. Later in life, you'll have more income. The same with myself. Like 20 years ago, I didn't have as much income as I have now, right? So based on how much money you earn, that's going to change your ability to purchase things. It may change your ability to actually buy things, right? So, if I win a massive lottery, maybe I'll buy a bigger house, or maybe I'll buy a fancier car. Whereas now I wouldn't consider some things because of my income level. So your income will change how much demand you have for all goods. Expectations. So think about what happened with COVID, right? When everything started shutting down, people started going after and trying to buy toilet paper, right? Halfway through the summer, or maybe in the springtime, lots of places were selling out of barber clippers, right? So your expectations of future events are going to change your demand, right? If any of you remember December 12th, 2012, there was, some people thought the end of the world was coming, so they would stock up on generators, water, all this kind of stuff. Your expectations influence what you may do in the future, and it may influence your demand, right? What am I going to buy now based on what I think is going to happen tomorrow, right? Next, price and quality of substitute / competition, right? If we have a product that has a similar comparable, if the price of that product goes up or down, it's going to change my demand for the current product that I consume, right? I used the example of Pepsi and Coke, right? If I don't care that much, either or Pepsi or Coke, if the price of Coke goes up, my demand for Pepsi may increase. If the price of Coke goes down, my demand for all these kinds of things for Pepsi may decrease, right? So the impact to demand is impacted by other of their substitutes or competition. Okay. Laws and values. If you think about things like cannabis, recently, a year or 2 years ago now it is, cannabis was legalized, right? So definitely, quite certain that once it became legal, consumption will increase, demand will increase for this product, right? Because there are some people who may not have done cannabis just because it was illegal, right? Not because they had any notion of it being right or wrong, perhaps, but they just didn't want to break the law, right? So demand can be impacted by laws and values of society, right? And so as those things change, and so you can see how as media and culture changes and moves our economy and our people a certain direction, it's going to change demand and supply of different types of things. And so now we want to pause and take a moment to think about the demand and how is it going to relate to what's going to happen to changes in supply. So changes in supply, you want to look at cost of production now. So now we have to change our mindset from the consumer, which most of you are very familiar with, to the supplier who you're not so familiar with, right? So if you think about a supplier like Walmart or Amazon or any company, their ability to produce or supply goods and services is largely dependent on the cost of their production, right? So if the cost of production goes down, their supply can go up. While if the cost of production goes up, their supply will go down. If it's a more expensive to do thing, it just costs you more. It's going to change your supply, right? Technology. Think of something like the assembly line, right? The advent of the assembly line, the invention of the assembly line, sped up production in industry, in manufacturing, right? So technology is going to change the ability to do certain types of things, right? I can reach more people with technology. I can do things faster with technology. So those are all parts of the production process. Efficiency, so this is kind of more generalized. If we just get better at stuff, if we specialize our workers, they're going to get more efficient at things. So theoretically, I should be able to change my supply or increase my supply with more efficiency, with more efficient production methodology, right? So those things will change supply. Natural disasters, so if you think about hurricanes, the wildfires that are in California, those things are destroying resources. Those things are destroying means of production. And so those kinds of things could potentially reduce supply, right? Our ability to produce has gone down because of natural disaster. And similarly, war, right? If there's war in your country, things are going to be destroyed. People are going to die. Suppliers of goods and services are going to cease to exist, or at least going to be slowed down. I'm not sure if you remember, there was a tsunami in Japan, right? And so that tsunami hit Japan and devastated parts of the country, and it was actually very hard to get parts for Japanese cars here because of the difficulty of the supply chain from Japan to get here, to get certain types of things here. And so war or natural disasters is going to change supply based on what's happening in that nation, right? So it's a very physical, destructive force. War and natural disasters are physical, destructive forces that can change economies. Politics can change supply, right? Determining what you allow to produce, what the public votes on producing, or what lobbyists choose to throw their money at politicians to make them help produce, giving them tax breaks or different permits to do certain types of things. All those kinds of things can change the supply of certain types of products and services. And lastly, policy, right? Similar to politics, but policy, thinking about government saying, is there going to be free trade, right? If you choose to allow free trade in your country, that means there's going to be more supply of goods and services for your people in all things, right? So supply might not be an individual organization or an individual company, but the entire supply of that nation for that certain product might go up because free trade. Or alternatively, if your country decides to shut down some borders and make trade less free, then supply is theoretically going to go down for certain types of things. Okay, so those are changes in demand and changes in supply. And so we want to look at what do they actually mean, right? How are they impactful? So we need to look at supply and demand and how changes in supply and demand operate when we're in a competitive free market system. The first two graphs we saw in this lesson talked about surplus and shortage, and so those two scenarios are inefficient practices in a non-fully competitive marketplace, right? So we want to look at what does a competitive marketplace look like in supply and demand changes. And so price will happen at equilibrium if supply and demand are competitive. Okay, if there are lots of suppliers, lots of demanders, and people know information, we want to understand that we want lots of suppliers and we want lots of consumers, because that's going to make equilibrium prices happen. That's going to make the market pretty efficient, right? Because we don't want individual producers to be large enough to control prices. We don't want individual purchasers to be large enough to control prices, right? Because that's going to create inefficiencies. That's going to create prices that might not operate the way we want them to. Fully competitive meaning that each seller has the same thing, right? I can't compare my local product here to an international product over there if they're not at least very, very similar, right? The international product is going to impact our marketplace because of the similarity and the competitiveness of that market or that product to my product. If they're totally different, then I'm worried less about that product because my product is unique, right? So competitive meaning each seller has the same thing. Otherwise, we have lots of different things which are not competing. Okay, competitive means people know prices and competition. I need to be able to know that I can get that product over there for cheaper. That's why all these apps, these with flyers on them. That's why companies like Walmart do price matching, so they know that they're always going to be competitive, right? So you want to ensure that you have free knowledge of prices and competition. That will create a much more competitive marketplace. And so this is what we call pure and perfect competition. Pure and perfect competition sounds great, but doesn't actually exist, right? Our government institutions and our marketing boards and those types of things want to ensure as much competition as possible. Why? Because economies' goals are to satisfy the needs and wants of their people, right? While businesses' goals are not to do that. Businesses' goals are to make money for the most part. But an economy's goal wants to satisfy needs and wants of their people. So they want to establish very, very competitive marketplaces. And those marketplaces are better for the citizens of the nation. Typically, again, fallacies of composition will say that some individuals might not benefit from that, but generally we want more competitive marketplaces to get better quality, better quantity, and cheaper prices in theory. So that being said, we need to take this moment to kind of look at what do changes in supply and demand actually look like here. So if I graph our standard supply and demand graph, we have supply and demand, we have equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. And so what does an increase in demand look like? So we're talking about an increase in demand being a change in the entire curve. So this right here, this demand change is an increase in demand. Notice how this was the original demand, and so maybe this is for demand for, I don't know, toilet paper. Demand for toilet paper has gone up, and so therefore the entire curve changes. This is a change in demand, okay? And so that's always step one. Step one is always a change in an entire curve, whether it be supply or demand. So step one, demand changed. And so this demand change causes something to happen. And that cause, or that thing is price. So a demand increase is going to cause prices to increase. Okay? So demand changes, therefore price changes, and in this situation demand has increased, therefore prices have increased. And that price increase is going to cause a change of its own. The price increase is going to cause suppliers to want to supply more. And so this number, step number 3, is an increase in quantity supplied. And you'll notice this red supply curve has not actually changed, and that's why I call this a quantity supplied, an increase in quantity supplied. So let's backtrack. Step 1, demand has increased. That causes a price to increase. So prices go up, that's step 2, and that price increase causes suppliers to want to have an increase in quantity supplied, right? So the price goes up and the quantity supplied also goes up. But this is not a change in supply. This is an increase in quantity supplied because the supply curve is still the same. So that is our increase in demand. And so if you look at that in the reverse scenario, you'll see a decrease in demand here, prices will drop, and then quantity supplied will drop. So this graph shows us increase and decrease in demand and increase and decrease in quantity supplied. And that's in contrast to our next scenario. And again, we're going to look at supply and demand from its base scenario here. And now we're going to look at an increase in supply. So now you see the supply curve actually changing. The supply curve changed fundamentally. It's different in its entirety. And that supply curve increase causes prices to change. And in this scenario, prices have decreased. Because when there's more suppliers, prices should go down. And so prices decrease with an increase in the supply curve. Right? Supply curve changes, causes prices to change, and that price change will cause demanders to want more quantity, right? So supply changes, supply increases, prices drop, and therefore demanders have an increase in quantity demanded. And again, this demand curve has not changed. The supply curve has changed. This is an increase in supply. This right here from this point to this point is an increase in quantity demanded. But demand has not changed. As you can tell, this demand curve is still exactly the same. And that's why demand is the quantity of a good or service that consumers want at various prices. Prices can change in a given time frame, right? At this price, we want that much. At this price, we want that much, right? So demand has not changed. Supply has changed. And again, we can show you the reverse. If supply decreases, prices will go up and quantity demanded will go down. Thank you.